Okay, I'm Irving Joyner, and I'm a professor of law at the NCCU School of Law. Yeah, well, by way of my involvement in civil rights activities, I started early in activism when I was in high school and then in college. I was actively involved in the movement to desegregate lunch counters and then to organize support programs and protests for efforts to desegregate facilities here in the South. I was an officer in the Brooklyn chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality and was very engaged in educational equity issues there in New York at the time when I was in college, and then I left college for the purpose of being more actively engaged in civil rights activities in the South. I was employed by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, which allowed me to travel around the country organizing local community groups to deal with voter registration, to deal with desegregation issues, to deal with prison reform issues, efforts to include African American history in the educational regimen, helping to support African American candidates who are running for political office. So a wide range of things that I was able to do starting when I was in college, and I've just continued that kind of culminated with my involvement in the Wilmington 10 case, where I was the international organizer for the Wilmington 10 Support Committee and the attorney for the group. And since I've been practicing law, civil rights has been one of the major focuses of my practice. So that's pretty much my background. In looking at what black masculinity means to me, I guess you focus on two different aspects of it. One is the biological, and whether the person carries the equipment associated with being a male, and being able to engage in those activities that I guess loosely define male-female relationships. The other part of that is more societal, and what society has defined masculinity as, or probably more importantly, what society has defined maleness as. And pretty typically around the world, all cultures seem to suggest that men are the alpha product, the leaders, the protectors, the providers, and generally people put maleness in that category based on your ability to provide those things that society expects of you, and that is being able to provide for yourself and your family, being able to protect yourself and family, being the head of the household, being the one who is more often than not in charge and doing those manly type things, those rough and tough kinds of things. And out of that societal expectations, we then seek to pass those learnings on to our children so that they understand the roles and the differences in what the expectations are. So pretty much around the globe, you'll find that society has defined maleness in that kind of vein. Well, with respect to the way that media portrays maleness and how it follows and projects this notion of what maleness is, the notion differs. If we're talking about white males, then there is one picture that's established in the media, and that is always the virile one, the most intelligent one, the one that is on top of everything. As it relates to African Americans, it is a different picture that's painted, and that is typically a picture painted of criminality, and the black male being of a criminal nature, out of control, not worthy of being associated with maleness because they are unable to provide the protection for the family, unable to provide for the well-being of the family, and the best thing that they have been able to contribute has been criminality. And that is the image that white society has cast upon the African American male, and it is one that has been bought into for decades in this country. Even back in slavery, the African American woman was the leader of the family, and when things had to get done, it was done by the woman, because white society made it a point to demasculate and the African American male, and to show that they were less than what the typical white male would be. And I think that societal view has been replicated in the media portrayal. During the Jim Crow era, African American women were able to be gainfully employed in any number of employment situations where the males were restricted in the kinds of employment that they could engage in. African American women were encouraged to gain education and to be the light for the community and provide education to the community, rather than black males who were expected to do the heavy lifting, the manual labor on behalf of whites. But the black woman was then elevated in the media and by society to a role in which they owed no allegiance to this traditional pattern of male-female bonding that society expected and had placed on white maleness. I think there is a better recognition by African Americans of the damage that's been done to the psychic, to the image, to the psychological well-being of the African American family and African American males in particular. We're dealing with a dysfunctional relationship between African American men and African American women. The consequences of what occurred during Jim Crow and during slavery are still being felt among African American men and African American women. And African American women typically hold African American men in low esteem. African American men who are able to rise out of the circumstances in which they find themselves typically don't have a lot of regard for African American women, and that's why they elevate or circulate around with whites and want to have white companions rather than African American companion. And it's a part of, I think, the consequences of this dehumanization that has been created over the years, where now the African American male feel that in order to prove themselves, they have to be a conqueror, and that being a conqueror is a conqueror of white women over white men. But involved in all of that is still this notion of violence, where if you can't gain that victory, then it is through brute force that you're able to achieve it. And I think that's a part of the damage that's been inflicted upon African American men by society and the media portrayal of who we are and what we are. In spite of all of that, I'm encouraged that African American men have been able to work through it to a large extent, but it's not complete because today the prison, school to prison pipeline is populated by black males. The prison system is populated by black males. The educational disparity population is heavily populated by African American males. When you look at our community without an education, that's heavily African American males. When you look at that part of the community that's in poverty, it's largely African American males, and society is still having that impact. But there are people who have been able to break out. I don't know just how strong those role models are for that part of the population that's been damaged by this picture of what's been painted of us. The impact of Barack Obama on the African American community was substantial in the sense that there was a role model. Someone who was able to demonstrate that they were worthy and academically gifted and physically attuned to the rigor that they were going to face. So I think that was a positive image, but it was only positive as to those African Americans who found themselves in that class of people. You still had a lower class of African American who I feel never were able to associate with Barack Obama because they saw him as being something other than them. After all, Barack Obama was multiracial. He was raised by a white family, not an African American family. He was raised in white communities, not an African American community. It was not until he got out of law school that he positioned himself in an African American community. So he escaped all of the traps that most African American men have to encounter and have to navigate through. He didn't have to do that. So he was viewed as being different, as an aberration, both by African Americans and certainly by whites, who saw the white half of him as being the thing that they gravitate to, and they could put behind them the black half of him that came from the African side. So yeah, I think that he was a positive role model for people who were on that class level or aspiring to be on that class level. But for the vast majority of African American males, I don't think that there is that same connection. They were proud of him and proud of what he was able to do, but they never pictured in their minds that they're going to be able to do what Barack Obama did. African American women, on the other hand, that's a whole different picture because he embodied what they want to become. So when you talk about you can be anything that you want to be, and Barack Obama is an example of that, African American women buy into that because they see themselves more positively than a lot of African American men. I think that in terms of the image that people should look up to within the communities, I think there are a lot of people that can be those images. The doctors in the community, the dentists in the community, the pharmacists in the communities, the teachers in the community, some of the ministers in the communities, all present positive images that people can look up to. The problem is that they aren't presented and portrayed that way. They are not in the media. You have to be a superstar to be in the media. You can't be a Tom, Dick, and Harry and be a model for the media. They're not going to push you up and put you out there as a role model. We don't have an African American media that's able to identify people that they project within our community as role models. And so what we are left with are the politicians who get notoriety, the entertainers who get notoriety, the athletes who get notoriety, and they become our role models. Charles Barkley, LeBron James, Steph Curry, they're the role models. But in reality, they're basketball players. They're athletes. That's not a role model because only probably 1 out of 3 or 4 million can become like-minded or in a similar position. So that is a self-defeating model to have when you don't have the skills to do that. But those other people who have been able to overcome problems and barriers within the community and have succeeded and have made a name for themselves, we don't see them. They're not in the media, and the people in the larger community don't see them because they live outside of those communities, and other than going to church, typically don't go back into the communities where the vast majority of African American males reside.